Howdy folks, and welcome back to the Inflection Cut. It's been a minute, and we're going to be talking soon about Justice League Mortal, but I think, Eric, first we wanted to take a moment to do a follow-up to our last podcast episode, which was the first time where you and I, putting our big brains together, could not come up with an inflection point that we thought worked.
We were wrong. Yeah, so let's talk about this. You know, we went through with Coyote versus Acme. In our universe, we did not see a way that this movie would make it to the screen, and yet...
It has. It looks like it's going to make it. So Coyote versus Acme has broken Hollywood history and been pulled off the shelf and picked up by Ketchup Entertainment, who we actually did talk about a tiny bit in our last episode because they were the company that picked up the Warner Brothers animated movie The Day the Earth Blew Up. And it's actually, I think, made $11.2 million, which is not a huge amount, but I think, as you were saying, they probably paid 3 Snickers bars for it, so I bet they've already made their money back.
Yeah, maybe 3.5 Snickers bars, or 3 Snickers bars and a Kit Kat. But the thing about Ketchup that's interesting is that before they were in the distribution business, they were in the financing business. Mm-hmm. So they know the numbers. So I'm pretty sure that they're really good at that aspect. There's a couple of things about this deal I think is interesting. The deal seems to be valued at somewhere between 35 to 50 million.
Sources vary a lot on this one.
And keep in mind that the way that WB shelved this movie was using the IRS Code 165 dead asset. So they got a $35 million tax write-down, which they are now going to owe the IRS back. So there's a couple things that I'm thinking about when I look at this, is that number one, they must have found some way through some of their other losses, which have been notable as of late, to be able to offset that liability that they were going to own again. But I think the bigger sort of driver about this was the fact that nobody wanted to take a meeting with WB.
Yeah, that's my gut, that what ended up driving this was more the fact that they've been losing deal after deal, and some of those deals have turned out pretty well, even in the post-pandemic hellscape that is, you know, theatrical cinema at this point. But you just mentioned the fact that they are probably going to be able to offset with other losses, and I think that was one of the reasons that you and I just could not see our way clear to giving it a second life in our world, because historically the way that the tax code that Eric mentions work is that effectively you declare the asset a dead asset, and that means that this asset can never produce income. In other words, like if it makes $1, Warner Brothers doesn't owe taxes on the dollar. Warner Brothers owes back taxes on the $35 million that they wrote off.
I think it's actually even further than that. Not only can it not make any money or any ancillary money, so even if the film itself didn't make any money, but somebody made a Coyote versus Acme t-shirt that somebody bought for $1.
Or they do a comic book of the script.
Right. It can't actually see the light of day. It has to be a truly dead and buried property.
And so by brushing it off, they now open themselves up to not only having to pay back the original $35 million in taxes that they owed last year in 2024 when they wrote it off, but theoretically, whatever juice and penalties there would be on that $35 million. And I expect that there would be some penalties. But that is where I'm wondering if maybe in the current political landscape vis-a-vis government agencies, want to be really careful, I know that people are listening, is it possible that there could have been a deal done so that they avoid the worst of the penalties?
Probably.
Eric also speaking very carefully.
At the same time, look, I'm not a tax accountant. And neither are you.
Nope.
And one of the reasons why our tax code and laws are so complicated is because there's a massive industry around it that, given WB has had a lot of notable losses on the box office lately, there's probably some way that they could have offset it anyways, which isn't the best, quote, revenue model.
So it'll be interesting to see if we ever hear a little bit more about how this deal got made, because I am certainly curious, and at least so far, the only thing that has been in the trades is an official statement by Ketchup that basically says, you know, the classic, we are so excited to be distributing this film and look forward to getting it to audiences, but we have no idea what happened behind the scenes. You and I both feel that this has got to be more complicated behind the scenes than a classic IP sale or a classic negative sale.
So what I'm curious about, given the visibility of this property now, not just because it is known to be a very entertaining movie as far as the test screenings are concerned, but then all of the controversy of it being killed and now being pulled out of the ashes, right? I suspect a lot of people are going to go see it. Now, when we talked about what they were asking for when they shopped it, we talked about the notion of the schmuck tax.
Right.
So let's say it does come out and it does $250 million plus. Does that sort of label Zaslav as the schmuck?
You know, I think it's hard not to. And one of the things that I wonder about this, and again, this is just like even more than the usual alternate universe speculation that Eric and I do, this is pure speculation. I have to believe that this deal getting done is a chink in Zaslav's armor.
I should hope so.
Not just that it makes him weaker moving forward, but I think it would not have happened if Zaslav had a strong hand. This is the first thing that I've seen to suggest that there are limits to Zaslav's ability to steer the ship and make some of these decisions. So in other words, although if you remember, one of the inflection points we decided didn't pass the muster at the time was the board telling him to go blow. That doesn't mean that there couldn't have been a little bit of that behind the scenes here.
True.
So if we think about the various players that are indirectly connected to Warner Brothers Animation, one of the biggest, and someone that we talk about from time to time, is a certain Mr. Steven Spielberg, right? So Steven Spielberg, for those of you that don't know, was the quiet guiding hand behind the Warner Brothers TV animated renaissance in the 90s. You know, his name is behind all of those shows like Animaniacs and Looney Tune, Pinky and the Brain, and all that stuff. So I also do wonder, we know that there were a lot of meetings that were canceled at the time. I would be curious to see if there is maybe now a Spielberg film in Warner Brothers' future.
That's interesting speculation.
Because again, I just don't think it adds up that this is as simple as Ketchum coming to the table at $35 million. All of a sudden, Zaslav is like, well, yeah, I said no to 70 last year, but 35 this year sounds great.
Yeah, also when you like do the math of like 70 and then you write off 35, so you're still at what, minus 35, and then you sell it for 35, but you also have to pay back the other 35, so...
And let's use the more generous number, the number that was in deadline, which is, let's say that it was 50.
Right.
50 is still much less than 70, which was what the original schmuck tax included price was.
But it's 50 minus 35.
Right, because at least, if not, probably a little bit more than that, as you're saying, with penalties, etc., and so on.
The question, though, so if you're Steven Spielberg, right? You can make a movie with any studio.
Certainly can. Although maybe a little bit less now. You know, he hasn't exactly been box office gold for the past several years. He's been critically lauded for a lot of what he's done, but he has, you know, Meet the Fabelmans was not a huge box office success. He took a pretty big swing with a movie that I actually thought was terrific, which was his remake of West Side Story, but that also did not get into the zeitgeist.
Yeah, that's true.
But he's still Steven Spielberg.
And certain directors or teams have a certain sort of like bank that they can cash in. So, for example, the Wachowskis, you know, made so much on the Matrix movies that they were able to coast on failure after failure, and they could still make movies. But in Spielberg's space, like, I think that Universal or Paramount would let him make whatever he wanted still. Universal pays him $20 million a year in perpetuity just for the parks.
Yeah.
Just to have the shark at the parks.
Yep. So I don't know if there's too much more to say about this, and we just wanted to, number one, acknowledge the fact that it happened, and there is this bright, shiny glimmer of hope, which is that, you know, where our imagination couldn't go, reality was actually able to go, and, you know, I think that's a good story.
Maybe even more importantly is that in an industry that is driven by creativity and talent, that creativity and talent sort of pushed the outcome that should have happened.
And won the day.
Yeah.
So take that, Zaslav. So Eric,
Halstead?
I was watching Babe Pig in the City recently.
The Fury Road to Babe's Mad Max.
It definitely is that. And you know what it made me think about?
I don't know, Superman?
It did make me think about Superman, that's right. Because before George Miller made his big comeback with Mad Max Fury Road, he got so close to making a Justice League movie. And there's quite a story behind this one.
Yeah, you know, this one's been talked about a lot.
It has.
But it's really interesting because it was a huge budget. It's coming off the heels of the Christopher Nolan Batman. So what went wrong?
So yeah, I mean, is this the lost opportunity that would have given us maximum Aussie joy, or was it a $350 million bullet that was dodged?
Could it have been the Millerverse instead of the Snyderverse?
Come with us on a what-if journey into the cinematic multiverse where all prayers are answered, every blank check clears, and there is no development hell. Let's navigate the film strip less traveled. I'm Halstead.
And I'm Eric.
And this is the Inflection Cut. So, okay, if we're going to dig into George Miller's Justice League movie, Justice League Mortal, I think that George Miller himself might be a good place to start. I mean, this is the guy that's had a wild freaking career.
Yeah, so let's start with Mad Max. I mean, he's made 4.5 Mad Max films.
There was one Mad Max film that he only partially, he was a co-director on.
Right, Thunderdome, right?
Thunderdome, yeah.
The
Mad
one with
Max 3
Tina Turner.
Thunderdome.
So George Miller, before he was a filmmaker, was a doctor. Mm-hmm. And they were making Mad Max in the Aussie countryside, and he was paying for that movie by performing as a doctor along the way.
And there is something so post-apocalyptic about that.
Yeah.
Have a surgeon will travel to make money off it. Of course, one of the things that's interesting about Mad Max, we often think about the Mad Max series as like the definitive post-apocalyptic movie series. But if you go back and watch the original Mad Max, it is arguably like, what would be the right term? Inter-apocalyptic? Basically takes place like on the edge of the apocalypse.
Pre-apocalyptic.
Yeah, like the world is not great, but there is society.
I mean, the other thing that I really like about the Mad Max movie, which you start to see a little bit more of when you get back to Fury Road, is that Mad Max is very much a character piece.
It is.
It's about how this man gets broken and rebuilds himself.
So Miller, like you said, makes this very low-budget Aussie movie by credit cards and using his own personal skills. And it's not like a huge blockbuster success, but it definitely, you and I will often talk about how many times the budget it makes, and I think that Mad Max made 30 or 40 times its actual production budget in theaters.
So there's that. We also will often talk about how certain movies have legs. Like Michael Mann gets greenlit for every movie he makes, regardless of what the box office is, because his movies have legs.
Yeah, they know that they'll still be selling it a decade later.
I mean, Heat is on cable rotation. It's almost to the same degree of Law and Order.
So he goes and he makes this movie, and it's a pretty big success. And the next film is a pretty obvious follow-up. He takes the last act of Mad Max. Again, the first 2/3 of Mad Max are probably way more sentimental and family-oriented than most people remember, because the movie really wants to make you feel it when the motorcycle gang, led by Toe Cutter, runs over his wife and kid. Like, there's been a lot of build-up to that. There's been a lot of, like, sweet conversations with his wife and quality time with his kids. So when that happens, you really feel his turn going from Max Rakonkowski to the titular Mad Max.
For sure. He starts the movie as the clean-cut Boy Scout of a police officer and ends the movie as a revenge-fueled, maniacal Mad Max.
Things that will show up in almost every Miller film, whether it is Mad Max or Babe, you see them here. Whether he's making an animated film, and he's made those, or a R-rated action movie, there is almost always a Looney Tunes-esque cartoon quality to large elements of the film. Like, I don't know if you remember this, like the first Mad Max, one of the first big car crash sequences, there are a few frames where a character's eyes very clearly bug out of his head, like Looney Tunes style, just before the explosion happens, right? And he always does that. He always likes to bring, no matter how serious the subject matter is, or how goofy the subject matter is, a little bit of that manic, cartoonish quality to his action.
The other thing that is present in all these movies is the balance between the feral and the humanity.
Yes. He's always very interested in sort of, let's call it the edge of humanity, or what it takes for society to break down to the point where empathy is gone, and introducing an empathetic character into that situation. Actually, I would argue, in fact, that outside of maybe Fury Road, the other film which most clearly does this, is actually the Babe films. That is very much what the Babe films are capturing. He goes
I'd argue it's there in Happy Feet as well.
There's a little bit of that in
It's a
Happy
little bit
Feet.
more subtle, but it's there.
It is there. It is there. The animalistic nature of mankind, and then the anthropomorphization of the animal, right? That dualistic nature. So from Mad Max, we go to exactly what happens when Hollywood drives up a dump truck full of money to your house and says, make another one, which is, of course, what was known as Mad Max 2 in every other country but the United States. But since the United States had only the thinnest of theatrical run of Mad Max, in the United States, Mad Max 2 is known as the Road Warrior. And it is, I would argue, until Fury Road, one of the finest pure action movies ever made. Much like Fury Road, very stripped down, story and characters are exposed in action. Another thing that is carried through a lot of George Miller's films is he has a very musical theater approach to his action. And when I say that, what I mean is that in the best musical, a good musical scene, whether it is a needle drop number or original book number, is the musical scene is used to present character. It's a way for you to learn a lot about the characters, a lot about the situation. Miller does that with action. Miller exposes character through action.
True. I would also argue a lot of action movies are action in absence of plot.
Yes.
And what George Miller does is plot in the form of action.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the movie that I think of that really sort of created that innovation is probably Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes, where a lot of like the most important character beats happen in like those large moments of action.
I would make the argument a big chunk of Fury Road is let's just make a movie that's just the Siege of Aqaba.
Yeah, I like that. I think there's a lot to that. So he makes The Road Warrior. It's made on like a fairly serious budget this time. It's I think an $18 million budget, which, you know, in the early 80s, that is a not insubstantial sum. And it's a huge hit, particularly considering that it is an R-rated action film. It does huge numbers, it has huge legs, as you were saying, and almost immediately a third film in the Mad Max series is greenlit. And that would be what I think is George Miller's sort of first stumble, which was Beyond Thunderdome. Now, we'll never know what the pure Miller version of Beyond Thunderdome was. It's probably a lot like what happened with the second Superman movie.
Yeah. What's interesting about Thunderdome is Thunderdome should have been George Miller's blank check movie, and somehow it was wrestled away from him.
Now, I think that there were a couple things that were going on at the time which are interesting. The first two Mad Max films had been produced by a guy named Byron Kennedy, who was a close friend of Miller's. And Byron Kennedy actually died in a helicopter crash not long after The Road Warrior was made. And, you know, from what I've read, Miller actually wasn't necessarily all that excited to jump into Thunderdome. But since the deal was made at the high point of Mad Max, there wasn't a lot of room to move. Nonetheless, at some point during production, George Miller takes a step back, and a man named George Ogilvy, who Miller had worked with some, they'd done some television work together, so it wasn't like they were strangers. But Ogilvy ends up effectively finishing Beyond Thunderdome.
Right.
And so what we end up having is we have a film, part of which feels very Mad Max, part of which feels
Like a Tina Turner music video?
like a Tina Turner music video, yeah. And here's the irony. I think most people would assume that the Thunderdome stuff was the Miller stuff. And then for those of you who know the movie, basically the first third of it is like takes place in this post-apocalyptic city. Second third of it takes place out in the desert with a bunch of kids. And then the third act is the two worlds mesh into more of sort of like a Road Warrior third act. My understanding is that Miller was actually more involved with the stuff with the kids. Now, if you look at the rest of his filmography, that's maybe less of a surprise.
Yeah, but also if you look at the tone and the way that part of the movie is shot, it looks a lot more George Miller.
It does.
Whereas
it does.
the Bartertown, I think is what it was called.
It was called Bartertown, yeah.
Those pieces do not look George Miller.
Yeah, and the dialogue, the way that the kids speak in this like post-apocalyptic speak, again, there's something very Miller about that. Now, I'm not saying that the stuff with Max and the kids is peak Miller, but it does feel very much of him. Whereas there's a lot of the Bartertown stuff that, while it looks cool, it feels a little bit like somebody trying to do George Miller.
Right.
I mean, I think that there's some stuff that is so Miller, like, you know, the 2-in-1 character Master Blaster, and that was Miller. But again, the execution and all the stuff with Tina Turner, it just feels like a Mad Max knockoff. And so Mad Max, like one of the complaints that comes out about the third Mad Max films, it ends up feeling like, you know, a knockoff of Mad Max. Now this takes us really into, let's call it the sort of the next arc of Miller's career, which we can look at it two ways. One would be that, this is when Miller actually goes and it kind of really expands the type of movies that he's making and establishes himself as an A-list director. Or we can look at it as a 25-year attempt to make a Mad Max sequel, and they'd both be true. Like, his plans for a fourth Mad Max film light up around 87, 88. And there's several attempts to get that movie made. Of course, it doesn't get made until, 2014 with the actual
Fury Road, yeah.
But Miller keeps busy. So Miller's first big hit after his Mad Max era is The Witches of Eastwick, which is a supernatural comedy with Jack Nicholson, Susan Sarandon, Michelle Pfeiffer, and let us never forget Cher. I have never read the book. My understanding is that it is deeply, deeply unfaithful to the novel. It is first and foremost a Jack Nicholson showpiece, I would argue. And it's a pretty fun one. It is a good movie, and it's a huge hit.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was definitely huge, largely because of Jack Nicholson.
Yeah.
And then he follows that up with Lorenzo's Oil,
Which is actually one of my favorite of his films. I gotta be honest with you. I love Lorenzo's Oil.
probably one of his highest critically acclaimed movies, right? It's a great movie.
Box office is not huge.
No. Do you think when he moves into kind of like Babe and Happy Feet, do you see that in your view as him kind of taking a stab at being a studio director?
Somewhat, although I would argue his peak as a studio director is in those 90s films, like Witches of Eastwick and Lorenzo's Oil. And I think if Lorenzo's Oil had gone differently, he would have continued down that road. I think, if anything, Miller's career is a history of reinvention while he waits to do another Mad Max film. There's Lorenzo's Oil, and then there is his family film period.
Right.
And like, there's a very clear demarcation point where he goes from Lorenzo's Oil to Babe, and that's the kind of thing he does.
And during that whole period, he's expressing himself in the Mad Max universe in comic books.
That's right. And so he's not leaving that behind. And by the way, we talk about Babe. He didn't actually direct Babe, but he co-wrote it, he co-produced it. And I really enjoy Babe, but the one that he directed, which is Babe Pig in the City, is amazing. It is the children's film as pure art. You're not wrong. It is absolutely the Fury Road, not just of the Babe series. It is the Fury Road of children's farm animal movies. And just to give you some idea, I'm not the only weirdo that feels that Babe is an amazing film. At the time, it was actually appreciated to us. Like, Gene Siskel, who was arguably the snarkier of Siskel and Ebert, it was his favorite film in 1998. Now, Miller's not done with children's movies about animals. He then goes to do not one, but two Happy Feet animated films with Robin Williams, which are about how, I think, penguins dancing save the environment.
Yeah, something like that.
And they're fine. They're not exactly my cup of tea. They are very well made. Miller's able to retain his persona as a first-class, artistically driven director while he's making what should, by any stretch of the imagination, be like pretty mundane Hollywood children's films. Like, somehow he's able to keep his rep. I want to note that for this entire period, he was actively trying to get a Mad Max sequel greenlit, which for a very long time was still to star Mel Gibson. I think the last attempt to really light up a Mel Gibson starred Mad Max movie was right around the turn of millennium. From what I recall, there was a deal that was done, but then the post 9/11 studio shakeup, it was one of the things that ended up not surviving. As a big fan of George Miller and a big fan of Mad Max, but not necessarily a big fan of Mel Gibson these days, I'm perfectly fine that another Mel Gibson starring Mad Max didn't get made.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at, for obvious reasons.
So he makes the Happy Feet movies in the mid-aughts, and that then leads him to end up getting tied into a deal around a Justice League movie.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll dip into the history of Justice League Mortal and then Miller's involvement in it.
So Eric start, we've talked about George Miller now. I think it is really important that people understand just how utterly chaotic things were with Warner Brothers' handling of the DC properties at this point, like the mid-aughts.
Yeah, I mean, this was where post Batman and Robin,
Everything had kind of fallen apart.
they were kind of like, we'll try anything. Now, during the Darren Aronofsky's Batman, this is the Jeff Robinov, Alan Horn period, where Alan Horn is the CEO of Warner Brothers and Jeff Robinov is president of Warner Brothers Pictures. They were the ones that both greenlit and decided to cancel Darren Aronofsky's Batman. Jeff Robinov was also the one who greenlit Batman Begins, Christopher Nolan's first Batman movie. So during this period, there were a number of movies that came and went.
Let's call it the spaghetti on the wall philosophy of film production.
So we've got the sequel to Superman's Return, which obviously was scrapped because Superman's Return's performance wasn't very good. We've had the much talked about Tim Burton, Kevin Smith, Superman Lives.
Yep.
My favorite part of that...
Nick Cage star, and we almost had a Nick Cage Superman, and I'm not sad we didn't.
My favorite little legacy of that is in Licorice Pizza, when John Peters, played by the great Bradley Cooper, goes to the main character and is like, you and I understand each other because we're from the streets.
Yep, and that's right out of a Kevin Smith monologue.
I love that. Then there's J.J. Abrams' Superman trilogy, which never happened. Wasn't there like a comedy relief Green Lantern?
It was actually going to be a Jack Black starring Green Lantern.
So this would have been him fresh off of High Fidelity.
Yeah, and I think maybe he brought a lot of that energy to Nacho Libre.
Oh.
Yeah, I think he brought some of that Green Lantern energy then to Nacho Libre, and I think it was better spent in Nacho Libre. So I'm okay with that.
Although I bet that wouldn't have been worse than the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern.
If there's a connecting thread between all of Ryan Reynolds' superhero films since Green Lantern, it has been his existential cry over the existence of Green Lantern. I feel like 1 out of every 5 Deadpool jokes is about Green Lantern. Anyway, going back to the turmoil at DC, some of the spaghetti thrown up against the wall was a spec script that was written by a couple that had a tangential Hollywood connection, right?
Right, yeah. So Kieran and Michelle Mulroney. Kieran Mulroney is Dermot Mulroney's younger brother. And so they wrote a spec script. From what I understand, it was very well received.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. It was good enough to kind of make it through the noise at Warner Brothers.
And when this movie was originally sort of put into George Miller was not the first choice for director. They wanted to bring in Jason Reitman, who didn't want to do it at the time because he was at that stage in his career where he really didn't want to do a franchise movie. He was doing things like Up in the Air. Of course, later on, he went on to take on a franchise with Ghostbusters, which I think he did a pretty good job with. Certainly the first movie I thought was excellent. The second movie was like half excellent.
Importantly, one of the reasons that Jason Reitman, I think, was so interested in making his name with more sort of character and critically driven movies is Jason Reitman is the son of director Ivan Reitman, who was very much a tentpole director. He was the one that directed the original couple of Ghostbusters. He directed a lot of really big budget comedies. At that point, his son didn't want to do anything that would push him into that same Hollywood sphere that his father operated in.
Yeah.
Obviously, eventually he got over that.
And so George Miller then signs on, and I think it was around September of 2007. So this is after the release of Batman Begins, but I believe before the release of Dark Knight Returns.
That's right, and I think that's really
Dark
important.
Knight.
At this point, Nolan has kind of created a new center of gravity for DC films, but hasn't completely reframed what superhero movies are the way that he's going to with his Batman sequel. Batman Begins does well. It does well enough for Christopher Nolan to then go on and make The Dark Knight, but I think it doesn't do so well that Christopher Nolan now kind of has the keys to the DC universe. They very much are still considering, we made that Batman movie, it did pretty well, now it's time for us to get the rest of the characters on the screen. And one thing that I think is actually kind of cool. So we are now in the same period when the first green shoots of the Marvel Cinematic Universe are happening, but that is still very much like an Iron Man Superman film that's in production that's going to come out. And it's interesting that before Marvel had dictated this is how you do a superhero connected universe, the reason that they were really interested in this Justice League film called Justice League Mortal, eventually, I don't believe that was the original name of the spec script, but by the time it gets into full production, it'll be called Justice League Mortal, is they had the very strong belief that the way to do a connected universe is to start with a team movie and then spin out the individual superhero movies from there.
Just kind of the opposite approach that Marvel took, which is they wanted to build
I'm kind of sad that we didn't get to see this alternative approach, because now I think that the Marvel approach is such a template that one could not imagine doing this. I mean, you could argue that the Snyderverse movies sort of tried to kind of split the baby with that, to a certain extent, and those have their own issues. Sorry, Snyder Bros. But this is an attempt to basically, all right, we're going to build a connected universe and we're going to build it off of a Justice League movie.
Which, when you think about the differences between DC and Marvel, right? That's somewhat consistent, right? Because DC had the connected universe from the beginning. DC had the multiverse from the beginning. Marvel kind of picked that up later, where they, sort of retroactively connected their universe and built the multiverse.
And it was actually DC also innovated in that they were, like, back in the 80s, they kind of were the first to sort of realize that they had created such a complicated multiverse that it needed some reconciliation, which created the first, what they then called the Crisis on Infinite Earth series, which was one of the very first prestige comic book events. Since then, they've gone back to that, well, at least a dozen times, which has kind of lowered the impact. But at the time, the idea of, like, trying to consolidate your connected universes was a really interesting and novel one.
So George Miller signs on for the movie, and in true George Miller fashion, he wants to cast largely unknown actors.
Now, I'm not convinced that he wanted to cast quite as young as they ended up getting, but we can go into that in a minute.
Yeah, so Armie Hammer, who is pretty infamous now, was cast as Batman, and DJ Cortana as Superman, who's maybe not so well known, but I gotta tell you, if you go back and you watch the Dusk Till Dawn, the series, which I thought was actually really good.
I really enjoyed Dusk Till Dawn, the series, and he was it Seth Gecko, right?
Yeah, the character that was played by George Clooney. And if you watch him and you see how he studied George Clooney's mannerisms and portrayed them, it really is a bit of a masterstroke, subtle masterstroke. And then Adam Brody as the Flash, which I thought, that's a choice.
I actually can see why Adam Brody was a good fit for the character that they wrote in the script. I'm not going to say that that was necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, I could see that. And then as the Jon Stewart era Green Lantern, Common, which I think would have been
I think at this point, arguably, like, the largest star in the cast, and also the one that is most clearly a slam dunk to me, actually. Common is the Jon Stewart Green Lantern, not the Daily Show Jon Stewart, by the way, just so you all understand. The Jon Stewart Green Lantern was sort of like the purest, most badass incarnation of Green Lantern, in my opinion. I think Common would have just knocked that out of the park.
And then, of course, because it's a George Miller movie, he cast Hugh Keys Byrne, who played the toe cutter in Mad Max.
And Immortan Joe in Fury Road, so he's got a strong Mad Max connection there.
As the Martian Manhunter, which, when I read the script, to me was really the unsung hero of the story.
Yeah, his Martian Manhunter would have been amazing. It probably would have been the high point of the film.
And then some other interesting casting. Megan Gale, who was also in Fury Road as Wonder Woman. And
she was Wonder Woman in Fury Road, but she was one of the wives.
Right.
She was the oldest of the wives, of Morton Joe's wives in Mad Max Fury Road.
And Tessa Palmer as Talia al Ghul, which I thought was pretty good casting.
Yep.
And then the other one that I thought was really interesting was Aquaman, cast by Santiago Cabrera.
Yeah.
I hadn't really heard much of him, but he was in the Picard series.
Yeah, he was sort of like, he was the Han Solo.
He was the Han
character
Solo
in
of the Picard series.
Clearly, the idea here is they were going to lean on the modern, darker version of Aquaman. Like, this was such a clear attempt to get as far away from the Super Friends Aquaman as possible. I would actually argue that by the time we get to Zack Snyder's DC movies, there's a certain extent to which that Aquaman is kind of splitting the difference. Like, this Aquaman is, like, so dark and so mad dead, always an inch from just like killing all of mankind.
And I believe he has the missing hand.
He does. He's got a synthetic water hand,
Right.
as I recall. So he's got the missing hand, the hook. Although we did talk about one of our villains, Talia al Ghul. Although Talia al Ghul, I think in the script is very much, I would argue she is a little bit more of like the villain sidekick role. She was not the main villain. The main villain was Max Lord, who has actually been on screen. Wonder Woman 1984, arguably the worst of the DC films, had Max Lord as the main villain.
I mean, I think they were trying to portray Talia al Ghul as the femme fatale. It didn't really play out that way.
Honestly, I think the way Talia al Ghul is played, let's just dig into the script. I'm just dying to dig into the script.
Before we dig into the script, and I don't mean to cut you off, let's talk a little bit about production of this movie. So it had a very large budget, $350 million, which actually probably, I think, would have made it the largest budget
most expensive
movie
film in history at the time.
At the time. It had tailwinds and it had headwinds. I mean, it had the tailwind of having a massive budget, but it ran up against some things which affected the script. And this is why I kind of want to bring this up before we go into the script.
That is true. Fair enough. So, yeah, let's dig into that a little bit. I mean, I think that they'd had two main issues. The first one, as you say, was around timing. I think in our last episode, when we talked about Coyote v. Acme, one of the things we discussed was the notion of the three burials of Coyote v. Acme, and I feel this film has a similar arc where it's about to go into production. They're getting ready to build sets, and then all of a sudden there's a writer's strike. The script, from what I understand, was not in the best shape, and so there's this great story that Armie Hammer tells about how at one point there was this like 48-hour jam session with George Miller and all the actors on the eve of the writer's strike, where they're trying to get as many ideas as possible on paper, right? They're all scrambling to get all these cool, interesting ideas because they've all got ideas about their characters. And Miller's, likes to have a very collaborative pre-production process that leans heavily on rehearsals and really allows actors to bring themselves into the character. And the story is told about literally they're writing and they're writing and they're writing. The writer's strike has just started, pencils down.
Right. And so after the dogpile on the script and the strike is lifted, they only have 6 weeks to take what is 200 pages of script and boil that down into a feature film level script. And that's the script that we have.
Right, which is around, I think it's like around 110 pages. And it really feels like 200 pages of ideas in 110 pages, and not necessarily in the best way.
The other thing that really it had working against it, so George Miller, consistent with George Miller, wanted to shoot in Australia.
Yes.
And the budget took into account the Australian tax cuts, which came out of the Australian Film Commission with the screen production incentives, etc. There's like a 30% rebate on post-production work that's done in Australia, and then there's like a 40% offset for production costs. There's some other tax incentives, but there was also some restrictions on you had to have a certain number of the above-the-line actors being Australian.
Right, and so that's a really important part of it. Let's dig a little bit more into tax breaks, because I think a lot of people do not understand how large a role tax breaks play into what movies and TV shows get made and where they get made. So in this case, at the budget that they were working at, these tax breaks were effectively essential to getting the production of Justice League Mortal underway. In the 2010s and a lot of the 2020s, Atlanta has become a production superpower. It's like where a lot of the Marvel movies are made. It's where a tremendous amount of animation is done.
And TV.
And TV is done.
And the reason for that is the state of Georgia decided to not have any cap on the tax breaks that they would give out.
Right.
So in some states, there is a cap, and once you hit that cap, there are no tax breaks available. In the state of Oregon, for example, that cap is only $2 million. So one production pretty much will eat up all of the tax breaks. And so once Georgia lifted their tax breaks, Atlanta became a boom town. So much so that Pinewood Studios, which is a legendary studio out of London where such films like Star Wars and many of the Bond films built a studio in Atlanta where most of the Marvel movies are shot.
Now, before then, there was a multi-decade period where the center of gravity was moving north of the border to mostly Vancouver, BC. There was a period in the 90s and 2000s where almost every syndicated TV show, and that was a period, that was sort of like the golden age of syndicated productions, were shot in Vancouver.
So what's interesting with Canada, not to get too inside baseball on the tax.
We're way too late for that.
Yeah,
buddy.
I guess that ship has sailed. So the Canadian tax incentives vary by province. So Vancouver was really great for TV. Even better for TV on the tax breaks was actually Waterloo. The problem is because of the weather and the look of Waterloo, unless you were shooting something that you wanted to look like Chicago, it was hard to justify shooting there. In Vancouver, it got to the point where there was so much TV going on that every single location was booked a year in advance.
So taking us back now to what's happening in Australia. Miller has worked hard. He's gotten the production set up in Australia. This is take 2. Sets are being built. It is happening. But unfortunately, there is a deeply ironic wrinkle, which is that the Australian Film Board, Eric, if I'm right, decides the cast is not Australian enough.
Not enough Australian top-line actors. I think...
Even though the crew was
Right.
almost entirely Australian. There was a lot. The number of mouths that were being fed were by and large
And there
Australian.
were a number of top-line actors who were Australia, including Megan Gale and Tessa Palmer and Hugh Keys-Byrne. I think that the suggestion was the Australian Film Council was trying to put the squeeze on WB. And at the time, between that and the fact that the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy was kind of elbowing this out a little bit.
Yeah, I think that that's really kind of its own thread. The impression that I get is that Nolan was never that excited about this. I mean, that might have really changed. Like, you and I were joking when we were ramping up to record the podcast that, like, I mean, if I was Christopher Nolan kind of pre-Dark Knight and I found out that George Miller was going to make a Justice League movie, my first thought would be like, man, I want to see that. But then the Batman movies go from like a surprisingly good film to kind of a cultural force.
Yeah. That combined with, if you read the script that we have, I think he would have said...
Had some concern.
Yeah. But I believe what ultimately happened before the project got canceled, they actually moved production to Vancouver, BC. The other thing that's notable is that the Australia Film Commission was disbanded in 2008. So like a year
Like
later.
the next year.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's much relationship there. Because like you said, I think that they were playing hardball, but I do not think they were expecting that their game of hardball would end in the film, you know,
I wouldn't be surprised if
dropping their
those
tents
things
and leaving.
are related, because they played hardball with them, and all of a sudden, the biggest budget movie of all time that was going to be shot in Australia is not going to be shot in Australia. That's a pretty big loss.
And DC has its biggest superhero movie of all time, which is actually a shockingly adult film, which is The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight does gangbusters. It's a huge success. Christian Bale's Batman is now the Batman. Neither you nor I could ever find any direct reference to Christopher Nolan speaking ill about Justice League Mortal. The one thing that we could find, however, was Christian Bale saying effectively, Chris and I would really like to complete our trilogy before someone does another take. And I don't know about you, but I read that as more than just an aside.
I think that's true. I mean, you could also kind of take it as like, look, we're doing our thing, so everyone else needs to stay in their lane for right now. So let's take a break, and then when we come back, let's dig into the script, and we can talk about, we've got opinions.
Yes, we do. Let's talk about that script. So, yeah, let's dig into the script. The script that Eric and I read, as he's mentioned, was most likely the result of paring down the mad pre-strike dash of everybody getting their ideas in. And the script, sure enough, reads like 15 pounds of a combination of mid and what in a 10-pound bag.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to flat out say it. I didn't like the script.
Yeah, I didn't either. And which is interesting because, like, when we were doing our research for this, most of the articles were along the lines of, oh my God, this amazing balls out George Miller version of the DC universe never got made and we were robbed. Don't get me wrong, there's sequences in this script that I think George Miller could have really George Millered. But I do not see where most of those other takes were coming from. This is a mess of a script. The characters are all over the map. The villains are terrible. I'm a comic book nerd, and this might be like the most inside baseball comic book script I've ever read, but not in a way I think that the coolest comic booky elements of it are not explained in the film in any way that would allow anybody with less than a DC PhD to actually understand what was going on.
There's a lot of cognitive dissonance in the script, more than I have appetite for. A lot of it feels like DC Mad Libs to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that this script would have gone through quite a bit of rework before they got to a shooting script. It really feels like to me either a long episode of the Justice League cartoon,
and this actually might have been a cool Justice League cartoon two-parter.
Or if they were going to do what now comes out as WB DC animation straight to Max, which this would have made a good version of that. But like a live-action adult Justice League movie to slot in with what is now existing around the Christopher Nolan Batman universe, I just don't think it would work.
Let's talk about the good and the bad. Let's start with the good, because I don't think it's going to take us very long. Number one, this is a script that was written by people that love DC Comics and love DC movies. Number two, from my perspective, I think that this is a really good cinematic presentation of a character which is woefully underrepresented in DC live action, which is the Martian Manhunter.
So the Martian Manhunter for me is like the high point of this script all the way. The other thing, I like the concept. The concept that Batman, because he's Batman, has collected a library on how to kill all the superheroes, because, you know, he's the only one that's not actually a superhero, and what if they go bad, and then somebody steals that to try and kill all the superheroes. Great concept.
But I think that immediately starts to get us into the pile of bad. Let's start with the first one, which is like the flip side of what I said of this was written by comic book lovers. I already mentioned the fact that like it is deeply inside baseball and not in a good way. Number two, like the references. Okay, there are some Christopher Reeve Superman references in here. Yay. But they're not like the Christopher Reeve Superman 1 and 2 references that you'd expect. The most direct Christopher Reeve Superman references are a huge percentage of the third act is a ripoff of the Richard Pryor Superman 3. And what is arguably the best action scene in the movie, which is actually one that Zack Snyder tries to do a decade later, which is basically Superman goes evil and everybody's got to fight him, reminded me, there are a couple of scenes in it that are clearly shout outs to the not greatly loved Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, where Superman fights Nuclear Man on the moon. Now, George Miller would have made that much cooler than, I don't even know who directed Superman 4, than that was made. And also, George Miller had more than the $10 that they clearly had to make Superman 4, because I think that was actually the Golden Globus Superman when they picked up the right. Number two, with the exception of the Martian Manhunter, the characterization varies between incredibly boring, Megan Gale's Wonder Woman, and really bad. Let's talk about Batman in this script.
Batman has two speeds. He has paranoid dick and bitch.
He really does. I mean, like, so the entire setup for the movie is Batman's a paranoid dick that doesn't trust anybody, so he's got to figure out how he would kill all the metahumans if he needed to. Who would have ever thought that writing those down and putting those ideas on a satellite could go south? But it does. And then Batman basically vacillates between being an unapologetic dick and being, like, kind of like, yeah, a whiny little bitch once he does start to apologize about it, where, like, we're all supposed to feel so sad about him because he's so lonely and life is so hard, and you don't understand he had to take on the burden of what to do. What if all these people went rogue? And I really think that I'm probably giving as much dramatic weight to that scene as is actually given in the script, and it's a pretty long scene. So the Barry Allen Flash feels like the writers from Friends wrote Barry Allen's Flash but left out all the jokes. Like, it has all of the vague misogynistic discomfort of a episode of Friends, but without the actual jokes. There's a whole sequence that takes place in a planet Hollywood for the DC Universe, planet Krypton, and the entire scene is basically about Flash leering at Wonder Woman on TV and making his wife uncomfortable. That's the humor. Wonder Woman's got boobies, and I actually think that, like, Zack Snyder's take on The Flash makes way more sense if you assume that he read this script. And it works better, honestly, when The Flash is an annoying, on the spectrum, 18-year-old. As was to Barry Allen, who's, like, supposed to be one of the older members of what will be the Justice League. He's, like, actually kind of the senior member. And I also want to note, he's probably the character in the script that gets the most development and has the strongest arc, and yet it's all bad.
So let's talk a little bit about the villains, because these villains were just terrible.
Right.
Maxwell Lord was terrible in the Wonder Woman movie, but that's because that was just not a good movie.
Pedro Pascal was bringing his A game, as he always does, and was trying to make Max Lord interesting. So the casting in Justice League Immortal for Max Lord was Jay Baruchel, who is probably best known as the skinny guy who's in all the Seth Rogen movies, and you may or may not know, generally co-writes and co-produces all of them as well. Going back to the fact that, like, Zack Snyder probably took a lot of stuff from this, there are strong Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor vibes to the Jay Baruchel Maxwell Lord.
And I really like Jay Baruchel.
So do I. But imagining him in this role, in the first act, there's an extended birthday party scene for Bruce Wayne. Oh my God, just imagining Jay Baruchel in that role reading those lines was like nails on a blackboard to me. I feel like that scene felt very much like a weak sauce version of the animated Bruce Wayne from the really great 90s Batman the Animated Series character. Like, it's just, they didn't have a lot of the animated Bruce Wayne in Batman the Animated Series, but when they did, it always leaned very heavily on a parody of the billionaire playboy.
Right.
Like, very one note, perfectly fine for the way that he was deployed in the animated series. This scene, I know it isn't like 30 pages, but man, it just feels like it goes on forever. It makes Max Lord just really annoying, and he has a different set of powers in this script that I actually think are closer to the comic, where he's like kind of psychic, but mostly annoying. And that scene...
Yeah, they're trying to do a Magneto thing with him.
Yes, they're trying to do a Magneto thing, but if Magneto was, like, just an annoying prick. Really no better, that same sequence also introduces us to Talia al Ghul, and this is one of many times where the film makes the odd decision to take an iconic character from the comics, strip them of any of the context that makes them interesting, and just kind of drop them in. Like, Talia al Ghul in the script, unless I missed something, is just some skirt that Bruce Wayne got really into, and it didn't work out.
That Bruce dumped.
Yeah.
Or ghosted, really.
Yeah.
Right? There's no reference to the fact that she's Ra's al Ghul's daughter and all of the legacy there. And like, that's all gone.
Yeah, that she was a trained assassin that may or may not be immortal. I don't think The Dark Knight Rises did great by Talia al Ghul, but at least they gave Talia al Ghul the connection to Ra's al Ghul from Batman Begins.
Right, and there was a motivation for why she wanted revenge,
well, here
right?
She's just kind of like a random, like, ex-lover scorned.
They set her up to be a femme fatale, but she's just there because she's pissed off because Bruce Wayne ghosted her. That's the whole story.
And she's also kind of a stand-in for, like, all of the women that Bruce Wayne has chosen Batman over.
Right.
And in fact, of the various weak sauce plays the script make, we have this whole build-up where it's clear that he understands everybody's weakness and he plays off of them, and all of them are really lame except for the Martian Manhunter's, which is kind of cool. Although the Martian Manhunter's weakness is fire, and the way it plays out in the script is very generic. And the only thing I was thinking of, like, well, mine too. Like, it wasn't even an interesting thing, like, you know, if he's around fire, he gets weak. It wasn't like a Kryptonian, like, sun. It was
you
just
light
like,
him on fire. Was he Richard Pryor?
You light him on fire and he gets hurt. Like, okay, yeah, that sounds bad. Yeah, you know, push me off a building, I'll hit the bottom and probably die.
But then you get to Batman's weakness.
Oh my God! So Batman's weakness is, and I swear to God, love.
So that was the moment where I was like, I'm out. I'm out. Batman doesn't love anybody. He's too broken. That's the point.
Clearly written by comic book lovers and people that love the DC movies, because there's this montage described in the script of all these classic women in Batman's life. So there's a Vicky Vale reference, and there's Talia al Ghul, Selena Kyle, there's Catwoman. But here's the thing: unless they brought back the Tim Burton actresses to do Vicky Vale and Selena Kyle, and I'm pretty sure that neither Michelle or Kim Basinger would
Basinger.
actually come back for it. The actual montage is just going to be a bunch of random women.
Yeah, it just doesn't work.
His weakness is love. Not only was it stupid and cliche, it is also a complete misunderstanding of what Batman's actual weakness is. Batman's actual weakness is weakness. In other words, Batman's Achilles heel is his need to separate himself from anything that might make him weak.
Right.
And the script actually lays that out. But that's not love.
Right.
That's dickishness. That's stoic dickishness.
He's so broken from the loss of his parents that he just doesn't want to feel anything.
Doesn't let anybody get close.
Even Maxwell Lord's motivation for his grand plan to me really feels pretty weak sauce.
There's that one moment early in the third act where we literally go from like 1 to 100 miles an hour in a flash, where we go from Max Lord's plan is to get rid of metahumans so he doesn't have the competition too suddenly. One of the most literal takeovers of the world ever, where he's trying to turn the entire world into a mass consciousness. And I think a problem with superhero movies in general, and something that Marvel has suffered from more and more as it ages, is the need to have the stakes always be global.
Right.
This is a great example of a film that did not need existential global stakes.
So we could sit here and we could hammer on this script for like 3 hours, right?
Oh, I definitely could.
Yeah. So let's talk about potential inflection point scenarios.
Okay, so let's assume that it's George Miller. There's a bunch of rewrites. There can be something of value here, right?
When we talk about the various types of inflection points, they usually fall into 3 categories. The films that are just so unlikely that we have to shape reality to make them happen, which is always kind of an interesting exercise. Then there's the ones that go right on the knife's edge until they fall apart,
Right.
like Paul Verhoeven's Crusade.
Right, where it almost happens about a half dozen times.
And then the third category are pretty much like any film where David Zaslav is involved.
Now, luckily we don't have to deal with that one here.
Not at this point, right?
Now, out of those 3 types, I think that Justice League Mortal falls pretty firmly into that second category. The kind of film that's on a razor's edge for most of its pre-production and production. Like, it almost happened several times. So it's really a question of, like, what direction do we nudge the world in that makes the best version of it happen?
One thing that could have happened is after the release of The Dark Knight, they could have come back and said, well, look, we want to do a Justice League movie. You got to clean up this mess of a script. Christopher Nolan's got to give it some level of thumbs up because right now he is steering the DC ship.
So we're going to move to something that's a little bit less Babe, a little bit less Happy Feet, and more Mad Max. Something that like could fit more tonally in the burgeoning Nolan-verse that becomes the Snyderverse. And I think that's not too hard to imagine.
I could see that happening. Another scenario is Miller is able to keep the Australian tax cuts.
Now, this one might be the most fun because this one would let us play casting roulette. The question would be like, how do we get a more Australian cast in place?
I think there's some good choices.
Yeah.
So let's start with Max Lord.
Let's move as far away as possible from Jay Baruchel. Let's not do the Eisenberg Lex Luthor here.
So who do you like?
When I look at Max Lord and the way that it's described, and if you want somebody to be more of a dark foil for Bruce Wayne, I'd want somebody who's kind of brooding, someone who's got some good villain history. I mean, we're not going to try and pretend he's not a villain. My first thought would be Hugo Weaving.
I like Hugo Weaving.
Yeah,
I think that like he could bring the menace.
He could bring a little bit of Agent Smith and the Matrix energy to Max Lord. He could make you scared.
Like if they really wanted a Max Lord who was like a Magneto, he could bring the Magneto.
Exactly.
Another guy who I think could do it, maybe not quite as menacing, but he can bring some menace, would be Guy Pearce.
If you cast Guy Pearce, I think the energy that you would go for would be less brooding and more manic. I think he'd up the energy level of Max Lord a little bit. This is a character that outsmarts the theoretically smartest person in the DC universe. And I think that either of our choices, they do it in a very different way, but I could absolutely imagine Guy Pearce bringing that energy that makes you believe that he was calculated enough to do this.
If they want to portray Max Lord as the suave psychopath, he could pull that off. In fact, he basically played that role in Iron Man 3.
I don't know if you recall this, but the production cast of Justice League Mortal is the first time that I am aware of that on screen we would have had a Alfred that wasn't English. The Alfred that was cast was actually Stephen Tobolowsky, probably best known for playing Ned Ryerson in Groundhog Day. And he was, as with so much in this film, a choice. But I was thinking, like, let's get to a more traditional Alfred and a character that someone from Australia. So what about John Noble?
So John Noble's, that's where I would land. Like that. I mean, John Noble would make an awesome Alfred regardless, right?
So John Noble was in the third Lord of the Rings movie as the king, whose name I cannot remember off the top of my head.
King.
And John Noble was also one of the main characters in the terrifically underrated Fringe TV show. He played an unhinged particle physicist. I think the best Alfreds are dry and generally subservient, but with the notion that they could take you if they need to. I don't even have a second choice. He's our Alfred.
Yeah, I got nothing.
I think another place where we could maybe get some more interesting choices would be with Talia al Ghul. So the least likely, but a very interesting choice for the era would be Nicole Kidman.
Yeah, I think that definitely would be unlikely, but really good. And also going back to Fringe, I would throw Anna Torv into that.
I think Anna Torv would be a really interesting choice. I
Also
like her a lot.
amazing in Mindhunter.
I'm assuming that we've got a slightly better script that gives us more context for who Talia is here. But I think all of them would be a believable foil for Bruce Wayne. And the best love interests for Bruce Wayne are always foils to a certain degree. When you and I talked about this, we didn't necessarily have a lot of thoughts of recasting the core Justice League, but there was one person that we should bring up here, which was an interesting... He already has, at this point, a relatively recent superhero history, but I think would be available, which is an option for Superman, Eric Bana.
Which I think he would do a good job. Not that I think that DJ Cortana wouldn't have done a good job, because I actually think he's an excellent actor. But if they needed more above-the-line actors that are Australian to keep the tax cuts to make this happen, Eric Bana would be a good choice. I don't have any other thoughts on recasting.
I mean, if we were to keep going, I could imagine swapping out Armie Hammer actually for Guy Pearce for Bruce Wayne.
At that period of time, yeah, for sure.
It is an awfully young cast for that script. Like, I think Armie Hammer at the time was literally like 21 years old. And I don't feel like the characters on the page read as like early 20s.
The one that actually stands out the most for me to that effect is actually Maxwell Lord, because he's this successful real estate magnate, a 22-year-old successful real estate magnate I have a hard time buying. So another, which I don't think is exclusive to the first option of this being relit after The Dark Knight, would be that they outlast the Australian Film Council. So when it gets disbanded in 2008, they get another sort of dip at the well.
Right. And I think you and I both agreed that, like, one of the things that happens here, I mean, there are several times when the film gets a wound, which didn't necessarily have to be mortal, but was, because there just wasn't a lot of studio energy behind it. So if we imagine a world in which there is a willingness to kind of sit for a few more months, you know, we've already got all the sunk costs and the sets and everything else, you know, not unlike Crusade. I mean, Crusade, it was a film that probably would have gotten made if it wasn't for one particular dinner conversation. Right. This didn't have that. This just had kind of like a lack of faith.
Death of 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. So if they'd been able to hold on for a few more months and outlive the Australian Film Council and had a slightly more Australian cast, then yeah, I think it would have gotten made.
The combination of outlasting the Aussie Film Council plus post The Dark Knight, DC decides, okay, now is the time to launch the Justice League because we just knocked the ball out of the park and DC is now it.
And it's coming kind of hot on the heels of the Nolan trilogy. Again, maybe Nolan's a little bit more hands-on. A lot of people don't actually realize that the transition from Nolan to Snyder it had more continuity than many people realize. You know, Nolan was pretty hands-on with Man of Steel. I think there's a bunch of reasons why the combination of Christopher Nolan and Zack Snyder were a particularly bad choice to do a Superman movie. And I think that would lead us. So I like that. I think
You
that
know,
let's...
and maybe Syncope, which is Christopher Nolan's production company,
Yeah.
is actually the production company behind this, is how this sort of comes together, which involves, you know, a rework of some of these characters and a rewrite of the script.
But I don't think we're thinking of it as some sort of sequel to The Dark Knight.
No,
This is
no,
its own
and this
thing.
isn't Christian
This
Bale.
is a new start.
Yeah, exactly. And or potentially DC does at this juncture what they are starting to do now, which is to say that there is a multiverse. So they
Right.
they beat Marvel to the punch on the multiverse, which they had done in the world of comic books already.
So basically we have room for more kind of darker standalone take. I do think that what happens though is that our 20% darker Justice League Mortal happens, it gets released 2008, 2009. Let's say 2009. Let's say there's enough breathing room given to the two Dark Knight Rises. It does kind of slot in instead of Man of Steel and its follow-on. It's getting released round about the same time that Iron Man is. That's another thing I think is important to slot in here. I think it does well. I don't think it's a huge hit. I do believe it charts a new path. What are your thoughts?
I think it does well, especially if they trailer it right, because it will ride on the coattails of the Dark Knight. So and that's where trailering it right really is important.
We're both kind of hoping that like it has a lot less of the awkwardness of the script and leans much more heavily on Miller's ability to build a character-driven action film.
Yeah.
You know, I think that I'm really hoping that fight between Superman and the rest of the League goes really well. The big twist in the third act where a member of the Justice League is killed is a real moment. So now we're in a world in which DC has two DC hits on their hands. We've got the Dark Knight series, and we've got this new Justice League.
They get a good action trailer, and then they voice over it from the visionary director of Mad Max and the Road Warrior,
and Babe.
Yeah. Pick in the city, Babe Pick in the City.
Pick in the City, yeah.
So it brings people to the seats. But I think the consensus, even with the rework of the script, is that it's still a bit of a hot mess, and it doesn't stand well in the shadow of The Dark Knight, even though I think the third act of The Dark Knight is a bit of a mess too. So I think it does well enough that Miller gets offered a sequel.
My gut is though it's not another $350 million film.
Probably not.
Right.
Yeah.
I think he's probably offered a sequel with a mildly lower budget, but he's given significantly more control. I mean, Miller was very much a gun for hire here. This is a film that he can build from the ground up.
He takes the sequel. The two big questions I think we would have to answer is, number one, what does that do to Mad Max 4? Does it get pushed forward? Does that mean he makes a Mel Gibson Mad Max 4 instead of the Fury Road with Tom Hardy? And then the other question I think we have to answer is, how does this affect the Snyderverse?
Right. So let's start with the Mad Max of it all. So if I'm George Miller and I've got a pretty big studio hit on my hands, I have a decent hand, but I'm not the only one playing cards at this particular table. You know, there's also Chris Nolan right there. I do, however, think that I could do a deal where I've got a solid budget for a Justice League sequel and a reasonable amount of creative control, but more importantly, I sign a one for you, one for me deal where I will do the sequel, but then we're rolling into Mad Max. We're rolling into a 2011-2012 Mad Max. And I think a 2011-2012 Mad Max is luckily not a Mel Gibson Mad Max. I don't know if it's a Tom Hardy Mad Max.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a Tom Hardy Mad Max either, but it's definitely
We're
not.
only a couple of years away at this point from the Tom
Definitely
Hardy.
not Mel Gibson, which is good. And maybe Babe Pig in the City, maybe Babe 3.
Maybe, yeah. My gut is that he does one more, but one which leans much more heavily on the comic booky elements. And, you know, looking at George Miller's career to date, I would not be surprised if his mandate is fun. How do we stand out from the towering achievement of the Nolan Batman movies? We're gonna make a fun-ass comic book movie. I think a great place to start would be where the script actually ends. And we know it'll work because James Gunn kicked it out of the park when he finally did it. The villain that is presented at the end of the Justice League Mortal script is Starro the Conqueror.
Yeah.
The gigantic starfish. And I could imagine a awesome George Miller directed maybe even James Gunn co-written. The timing is not bad for this. Justice League versus Starro the Conqueror movie.
So how does this affect the Snyderverse?
It does not happen. The Snyderverse happens because Christopher Nolan is given the mandate to do a Batman like Superman. And I think that if there is a solid running alternative to the Christopher Nolan grounded, gritty Batman, there isn't that appetite.
I think that this paves the way for a much more interesting career for Zack Snyder as well.
Let's not underestimate that. I think that Zack Snyder was as hurt by DC as DC was hurt by Zack Snyder. So we've got Zack Snyder off making less important, probably more fun movies. I think that we get a very Fury Road-esque Mad Max, but again with more studio support behind it, and a Miller that has now had more hits recently behind him, so he's got more room to move on things. And I think that's a universe worth living in.
Yeah, in this universe, everyone wins except maybe Mel Gibson. And that's okay.
So the other important thing about this Splinter universe is that I think we both agree that Mel Gibson is still canceled. And with that, I think that it's a good time to bring this little story to an end.
Yeah, I mean, we'd love to hear what you guys think about it, so let us know.
As always, we really appreciate any feedback that folks are interested in giving us. You know, we love making the podcast. Get it wherever podcasts are sold, and all podcast platforms are created equal, but some are more equal than others. So, you know, jump on iTunes or Pocket Cast. Give us a subscribe. Give us a like. Reach out to us on those platforms with your feelings. And Eric, I'll see you in the next one.
We'll see you.